Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hi, and welcome back to the ISO Show, to episode 2 of our 22301 Steps to Success series with our guest, business continuity expert, Rachel Churchman, who's a managing consultant here at Blackmores. Just to recap, we'll be taking you through the 3 simple steps, which is create, share, and engage. During the last episode, we covered the create part, which is the creation of the business continuity management system. And in this episode, we'll be moving on to how business continuity can best be shared and communicated. You may wonder why the sharing part is so important. I mean, you've got the system in place, right? What more do you need to do? Well, time and time again, we see businesses that might say they've got a business continuity plan in place, but either A, it hasn't been communicated, which is quite often the case, it's tucked away somewhere on a server, or B, it doesn't actually cover all critical services, or C, it's not actually been updated or even tested. In fact, here are a few statistics to back this up. Only 30% reported to have a fully documented disaster recovery strategy in place. And only 33% revealed that their disaster recovery plan proved inadequate when deployed in response to an outage. So basically what that means is that a third of those systems that are actually in place are actually useless when they're invoked. So what's the point? And this basically means that 2/3 of businesses are ill prepared when disaster strikes, doesn't it? Which is pretty scary. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome back Rachel Churchman, who's now going to take us through the next step in implementing ISO 22301. Welcome back, Rachel.
Hi Mel, thank you for having me back for episode 2. Sharing. Probably one of the second most important element of any business continuity plan is making sure that everybody understands there is a plan in place. So as anyone has had experience of business continuity, which I think pretty much the whole UK, if not the world, is definitely understanding business continuity now during the COVID-19 pandemic, it's that communication is key to making sure that there is an effective response in place. So the whole sharing element of ISO 22301 is vital for the effectiveness of the management system. So from just the communication point of view, and I know we touched on this briefly in the previous podcast, but it really is so vital that you plan for how you are going to communicate to people. You need to understand who it is that needs to have the information for your business continuity plan, because they might not all be within the offices. You might have remote staff, you might have engineers or staff going to site. It might be that you need to understand how you can communicate with them. They might not all have mobile phones. And we all know that with GDPR, there has been a lesson learned in sharing of personally identifiable information. So you may have a whole chunk of your workforce that needs to understand BCP and be informed of a BCP event that doesn't have access to email and doesn't have a company mobile. So there's a lot of things we need to take into account when we're looking at communication. But it's also who is going to communicate. Where do the messages need to come from? Is that from senior management, line management? What we don't want is Chinese whispers in the event of a BCP response. So you need to understand also when you're going to communicate, and ideally part of the implementation of the management system, we're going to start to look at pulling together some pre-drafted messages that can be used very quickly when we're invoking our response plans for reasonably foreseeable events. That these can be tweaked and amended, but at least the thought has gone into the key messages we want to communicate. And it's planning for effective communication that can make or break an effective BCP response. I touched on earlier in the previous podcast awareness training and how important that is for your business. People need to understand the part they play in a business continuity response. So there's a requirement to undertake that awareness training for staff, and it's for all staff, not just those that have an active role within a plan, but for those that perhaps are just going to be simply following the orders given by their line management. Those that do have a role within a plan are going to need additional training to understand what it is that we expect from them and what we need them to do in terms of response. And we mustn't forget the deputies, because every response plan will not only have somebody named with a role, but they'll have a plan B within the response plan. They'll have a deputy. They also need to be trained. It's important to understand that people can react very differently to that expected in an emergency situation. People can make rash decisions, knee-jerk decisions that they think they're doing for the good of everyone else, but perhaps might be contrary to the planned strategy and the planned response. So it's absolutely vital that staff are made aware of what it is we expect of them in a BCP event, what role they're going to play within it, and also how they're going to understand when a business continuity event has been invoked. Now, the awareness training can be reinforced and supported through actually exercising and testing the plan as a team. So this is an effective way of walking through the theoretical, taking time to consider the various scenarios and being able to make well-informed decisions but within a calm environment. And this can prevent those knee-jerk decisions in the event of an actual incident. And the exercising and testing will also involve a lot of the key interested parties, and that can be the wider staff, the wider workforce, not just those immediately involved in a plan. And it can also involve those key interested parties that perhaps are outside of the organisation, such as key suppliers. And that will help stress test their ability to support your business in a time of crisis. And any lessons learned from these tests, whether that's planned or unplanned, so for instance COVID-19 is very much an unplanned test at the moment for everybody, should always be followed up with a lessons learned exercise to make sure that we are taking those lessons learned and applying them and updating our response plans in line with changes or issues that perhaps arose that we didn't originally foresee. And then those response plans then need to be re-communicated in the business.
So regarding the testing then, Rachel, you probably come across, in your experience, lots of different examples where those tests have gone ahead and they've actually failed. The business continuity response plans are just not working. Could you provide us with a couple of examples of some typical response plans that haven't worked and the reason why, and what the value of that was to the business in actually putting that to the test?
Yeah, sure, I can give you some examples. So let's take a test whereby our strategy is for staff to work from home. So we have undertaken an actual test where part of a team of people have taken a few days to work from home and not come into the office in order to test their ability to work from home. And in the main, it was fine, the test worked really well and people were able to do the work. But there were a few who actually, when put to the test, couldn't access what they needed to access. And some was down to the fact they just didn't have the ability to access the systems remotely. So it was a permissions-based IT issue. But more commonly, it was down to local broadband, their own ISP, internet service provider, that was actually failing the staff. So it was through no fault of their own, but actually the internet was so unreliable when they were working at home that they weren't productive, they weren't efficient, and they couldn't get the job done. So in this instance, the response plan had to be amended and changed to enable those individuals to actually work in a different location where they could be efficient and effective. And that was actually a different office for the organisation. But the assumption was that because the internet was fine for sort of local domestic internet use and browsing, that it'd be fine for business. But actually the systems and the processes being covered were far more sort of bandwidth intense, and it just wasn't possible. So that's an example of how testing actually affected a change within a response plan.
Great, yeah, and we've seen that actually firsthand with, I think since COVID-19 started and we've been working remotely, we've seen the difference with some companies, how they've almost, instantly switched to remote working for their workforce, and it's not been a problem at all. But we have encountered some companies where it's taken them weeks and weeks to get their IT systems ready so that all of their staff are actually operational. So although we couldn't have planned necessarily for this pandemic in many cases, for those companies that did have business continuity plans in place and had tested them, we found that they've actually managed to recover and get back to some kind of business as normal much quicker, which has resulted in a reduction on loss of earnings and being able to function. Great. So where do we go next then as far as the sharing is concerned of the management system?
So, of course, in terms of sharing the management system and also the key business continuity response plans, part of the other sharing is making sure it's available at point of use, making sure people have access to it when they need it. From a business continuity point of view, that's vital. And as you said, Mel, sometimes it's the IT systems that can let us down. So we can't just make the assumption that if we put it in the cloud, it's going to always be ready and available to us on our file servers. Luckily, cloud-based solutions are more stable and more reliable these days. We tend to have a 99.999 uptime guarantee. But it is always good just to have that plan B and have that management system available and shareable for the BCP team in a different location as well. So once we've done the training, the awareness, people know what they're doing, we've tested the response plans, and we're exercising the response plans and we're making it available to everybody. The last part of sharing is really understanding where we've got those third-party dependencies where perhaps we may need to share elements of our BCP response with our key suppliers and supply chain. And that can be sort of different for every organisation depending on how many external dependencies they have. But it's clear that everyone who has a part to play, whether that's internal or external to the business, understands the response plan and the part they play in that, and that they are part of that testing and exercising.
Thanks, Rachel. That's been really helpful to share those hints and tips for all our listeners. So if you'd like to gain further knowledge on the standard, we've actually got an e-learning course available which goes into much more detail on the standard itself. And for our ISO Show listeners, we're giving you a 10% discount as well. So just enter ISO Show BCP, that's ISO Show BCP, in the discount section on the e-learning page on the website. And you'll be able to also access some other useful information on our website too, like the free business impact analysis template that we mentioned in the last episode. So that's also available on the website on www.blackmoresuk.com. So thanks once again, Rachel, and I look forward to catching up with you on the next ISO show.
Thanks, Mel. I'm looking forward to coming back.
Looking to use ISO standards to drive better business practice? Contact us at blackmoresuk.com to access further information and book your free 15-minute call.